Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The room buzzed with clipped voices, the smell of coffee and dust, the hum of projectors spilling light across grainy satellite images. Men leaned over maps, arguing over routes and contingencies, their pens tapping, their arms crossing. Orders slid across the table like sharp stones, but her chair, it might as well have been empty. She sat there, hands folded, eyes steady. They didn't look at her, not once. It wasn't that she was invisible. She was the only woman in the room. The youngest, too. Every uniform in that room carried years of service stitched into the fabric, scars hidden beneath the sleeves. And then there was her clean face, soft voice, a record too short to matter. They had a word for her, burden. No one said it out loud, not in front of the commander. But she had heard it whispered in hallways, carried in the laughter when she walked past, heavy in the pauses after her name was called. Burden. And still she listened, because listening had always been her weapon. The map spread before them showed a valley marked in red, hostile lines, a convoy that never returned, signals lost, civilians caught somewhere in the dark hills, their location uncertain. The plan was fragile, a thin thread stretched across fire. Everyone in the room knew it, but no one dared to admit how easily it could break. She saw it instantly, the blind spot, the missing piece. Her heart pressed against her ribs, her lips parting as if to speak. But then she stopped. She caught the way one of the men glanced at her, sharp, dismissive, daring her to open her mouth, and the way another one smirked, waiting for her to make a mistake, to give them proof. She didn't speak, not yet. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the table, hiding the storm beneath her calm face. Because there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. That night she sat alone in the barracks, boots unlaced, the desert air slipping cold through the broken window. The others laughed in the corner, trading stories too loud, too careless. She stayed in silence, tracing the faded lines on a folded photograph she kept tucked in her pocket. The photograph was old, creased, a little girl with wild hair, a woman standing behind her, one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, both smiling, both looking at the camera like it mattered. She had never shown anyone the picture, never explained who they were. Because if she did, she would have to tell the rest of it, the reason she had come here, the reason she stayed, no matter what names they gave her. The girl in the photo was her sister. And her sister was gone. Not gone in the way soldiers write on reports, not deceased, not missing. Gone in the way that no words ever hold, stolen by men who thought war made them gods. She had been 14. The soldiers who took her never saw justice. The world moved on. But she didn't. Every mile, every mission, every silent night in uniform, all of it had been her answer. She would carve her sister's name into memory, even if no one remembered hers. The next morning, the mission was confirmed. Convoy at dawn, 6 vehicles, dust rising against the pale horizon, the kind of light where shadows stretched long, where nothing was certain until it was too late. She took her place in the second truck, pressed against the window, rifle balanced across her knees. The others talked over the roar of the engine, voices rising and falling like the desert wind. She stayed quiet as always. But silence isn't weakness. Silence remembers. Silence notices what noise covers. And she noticed. The road was wrong. Her eyes swept the ridges, the rocks lined like teeth against the valley walls. Birds should have flown at the sound of engines, but the sky was empty. The desert was too still. She leaned forward, throat tight. She could speak now. Warn them. But she hesitated, her tongue heavy. They had called her burden too many times. And yet, she thought of her sister. The word tore from her chest before she could stop it. Stop the truck. The driver flinched, confusion flashing in the rear view. The squad leader twisted in his seat, irritation already darkening his face. What? The ground erupted before the word finished. Heat, fire. The first truck lifted into the air, steel and dust scattering like paper in a storm. Screams cut through the blast, drowned in the roar of detonations. The ambush had begun. The valley collapsed into chaos. Bullets tore through glass. Engines died in choking smoke. Shadows spilled from the ridges, weapons flashing. She pressed against the door, rifle raised, ears ringing. Training took over where thought failed. One breath, one shot, a figure crumpled, another flash, another silence. The others shouted, commands lost in the storm. Men scrambling for cover, some crawling, some dragging the wounded. The air burned with metal and blood. And through it all, she felt it, that weight on her chest. If she hadn't spoken, they all would have been gone in the first blast. For the first time, the silence broke. The men looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. But she didn't feel proud. She felt the ache in her arms, the tremor in her lungs, the echo of her sister's face in her mind. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here because memory demanded it. The firefight dragged on, seconds stretching into hours. And when it finally ended, when the smoke thinned and the ridges fell quiet, the convoy was half destroyed. 3 men gone, 2 more bleeding into the dirt. And her hands, red from holding the bandages, from pressing against wounds she couldn't close. No one called her a burden that night. But she didn't sleep, because she knew this was only the beginning. There was still something she hadn't told them. Something that would matter more than any of them realized. She stood at the edge of the campfire's glow, arms wrapped around herself, while the others slumped in silence. The flames cracked and spit, sparks drifting into the desert night. Shadows bent across the broken vehicles, the wounded lying still under rough blankets. No one spoke to her. Not out of mockery now, but out of something sharper, something unsettled. Because when the blast came, when the fire swallowed the first truck, she had been the only one who saw it coming. And she had shouted. She had saved them from complete erasure. And that kind of clarity, it frightened men. They looked at her differently now, not dismissive, not openly hostile, but with that weight in their eyes, like they had glimpsed something in her they didn't understand. She felt the stairs pressing against her back, felt the silence pressing into her ears. So she stayed away from the circle of firelight, breathing the cool desert air, her hand slipping into her pocket. The photograph. Her fingers traced its edges again, the crease across her sister's smile. She hadn't told them, not yet. She wasn't sure she ever would, because to speak it out loud meant to give it shape, to give it life, to admit the wound that never closed. And wounds like that, soldiers don't forgive them, not in others, not in themselves. The commander's voice finally cut through the night. We moved before dawn. The words fell flat, heavy. The men shifted, weary eyes lifting, but no one argued, not even the wounded. There was no choice. They were exposed here, their convoy burned, their enemies watching from the hills. To stay was death. But moving meant something worse. The path forward. The same path she had seen earlier, riddled with blind corners, narrow cliffs, terrain designed to swallow them whole. She could already see the trap waiting ahead. Her stomach tightened, her lips pressed together. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell them what she saw, the instinct that burned in her chest like fire. But then she caught it again, that flicker in their eyes when they glanced at her, suspicion, wariness, as if her voice carried both salvation and curse. So she said nothing. Not yet. The convoy limped forward at dawn. Engines coughed, metal groaned, and the desert lit with pale gold as the sun climbed. Dust rose like ghosts behind the trucks, marking their trail for miles. She sat in the back, rifle across her lap, the air thick with the smell of fuel and dried blood. Her ears strained for every sound beyond the wheels, the crack of a branch, the clatter of loose stone, the silence too heavy to be real. And then it came. Not the explosion this time. The voice. Static first, then sharp, broken words across the comms. Civilians trapped valley coordinates. The signal dissolved into static again, but it was enough. A lifeline in the dark. The commander leaned forward, eyes burning, and ordered the convoy toward the valley. Her chest went cold. Not that valley. Not those coordinates. She felt it instantly. The same blind spot, the same trap waiting just beyond the edge. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She could stop them now. She could speak. But then she remembered the night before, how they looked at her, how silence felt safer. So she swallowed the words. And the convoy turned. The valley closed around them like jaws. Cliffs rising on both sides, the sky narrowing overhead. The trucks slowed, engines groaning. Men gripped their rifles tighter, eyes flicking across the ridges. It was too quiet. She gripped her rifle, every nerve screaming. Her gaze swept the rocks, searching for the glint of metal, the flicker of movement. And then there. A shadow, a barrel. The first shot cracked. It hit the windshield, shattering glass. Then came the chorus, rifles barking from above, the cliffs exploding in fire and sound. The convoy scattered, men diving for cover, the wounded crawling through dust. Bullets tore through steel, ricocheting like hail. She hit the ground hard, cheek pressed against the dirt. The taste of sand filled her mouth, her ears ringing. And through the chaos, a thought cut sharp. She had known, she had seen this coming, and she had stayed silent. Her throat burned with it. Her silence had cost them blood. The fight was brutal. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't clean. It was survival. Men firing blind into the cliffs, shouts drowned in the roar of gunfire. She pressed against a boulder, rifle braced, eyes narrowing on the ridge. One breath, one shot, a figure collapsed. Another breath, another shot. Her world narrowed to rhythm, to precision, to the space between fear and duty. But she couldn't close her ears to the screams. One of the younger soldiers, barely more than a boy, dragged himself across the dirt, his leg torn open, his voice breaking. "Help me, please." She froze, sight still locked on the ridge, every instinct screaming to keep firing. But then her eyes flicked down. The boy's hands clawed at the sand, blood marking every inch. And something inside her cracked. She broke cover, crawled across the dirt, bullets snapping past, sand exploding around her. She grabbed the boy's vest, hauling him into the shadow of the boulder. His face was pale, lips trembling, but his eyes met hers with raw, terrified gratitude. "Stay with me," she whispered. Her voice was steady, though her chest was shaking. "Stay with me." Hours stretched. The sun climbed, then burned overhead. The firefight dragged into exhaustion. And finally, silence. Not peace, not safety, just the kind of silence that means one side has stopped firing. The commander gave the order to move. They left the valley slowly, carefully, carrying their wounded, dragging what was left of their supplies. The air reeked of smoke and iron. She walked at the back, rifle slung, her uniform torn, blood soaking her hands. Every step echoed with the same truth. Her silence had almost killed them. And yet, her courage had saved one life, one boy breathing where he shouldn't have. And in the balance of war, sometimes that was all that mattered. That night she sat apart again, the photograph hidden in her hand. The boy she had saved lay nearby, sleeping under morphine's haze. His chest rose and fell, fragile but steady. The commander approached her slowly. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he said it. "You saw it, didn't you?" Her breath caught. He didn't accuse, he didn't mock, he asked, soft, heavy. She didn't answer, not with words. She only looked up at him, eyes hollow but burning. And he understood. He nodded once slowly, then walked away. She exhaled, the photograph trembling in her hand. Because she knew now, Her silence wouldn't hold forever. The truth she carried, it would come. And when it did, everything would change. Why did the boy keep staring at her? The others had forgotten by morning, burying themselves in routine. Weapons cleaned, rations split, radios checked, though the static never eased. Each man carried the weight of loss in his own way, through silence, through jokes too sharp, through eyes that never rested. But not him. Every time she glanced across the camp, she found his eyes waiting. Not wide with fear anymore, not filled with pain, just steady, searching. As if he wanted to ask her something. As if he already knew the answer. They moved at dawn again, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers, leaving behind the charred skeletons of trucks. The desert stretched wide and merciless, the heat a weight pressing on their backs. The boy hobbled near her, his leg bound in cloth, his rifle clutched tight though his arms shook. "Why did you come back for me?" His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. She glanced at him, her lips parting, but no words came. "Everyone else," he stopped, breath catching. "They looked away, you didn't." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say his face, pale in the dust, had burned into her like memory. That in his voice she had heard her sister's cry, the one no one had answered. But she couldn't, not yet. So she gave him the only truth she could. "Because you were there." That night the commander spread a map across the dirt. His fingers traced a line toward the mountains, his voice low, careful. "Safe zone. If we make it there, we can signal for extraction." The men leaned in, exhaustion carving deep shadows into their faces. But she stayed back, eyes scanning the terrain, memorizing every contour, every valley where silence could hide an enemy. Her instinct screamed again. The path was wrong, too exposed, too predictable. But before she could speak, another soldier cut in. "We don't have a choice." The commander nodded, decision sealed. She bit her tongue until it hurt. Because if she argued now, if she said what she saw, they would hear accusation. They would hear the same silence breaking that had saved them once and almost cost them everything the next time. And yet, her sister's face flickered again, that smile frozen in time. She had promised herself she would never stay silent again, never let danger swallow the innocent. But promises are fragile when no one believes in them. So she folded the map quietly when the meeting ended. And she kept her silence. The march stretched through the night. Stars burned overhead, cold and sharp, while the desert wind cut across their faces. Boots dragged through sand, weapons clattered softly, every man moving like a shadow half-formed. She walked near the rear, eyes scanning the ridges, ears straining for sounds beyond the crunch of steps. The boy stayed close, limping but determined, his breath ragged. At one point his hand brushed hers, not on purpose, just the stumble of exhaustion, but it lingered. "You don't say much," he whispered. Her lips curved just barely. "Neither do you." He smiled faintly, then fell quiet. But his words stayed with her. "You don't say much." And in that silence she wondered, was it strength or was it cowardice? Near dawn, they reached the ridge overlooking the mountains. Relief rippled through the men, some collapsing against rocks, others lowering their rifles for the first time in hours. But she stood still. Something was wrong. The air was too still, the ridges too quiet, no birds, no wind. Her breath caught. And then movement. Figures rising from the rocks, rifles glinting in the pale light, shadows spreading across the ridge like a tide. The trap had closed again. Bullets cracked, men shouted. The world fell into chaos once more. She hit the dirt, heart hammering, sand stinging her face. Gunfire rained down, the men scattering, some firing blind, others dragging the wounded. The boy screamed as he fell, his wounded leg giving out. She reached him in seconds, hauling him into cover, her rifle snapping up. One breath, one shot, a shadow dropped. But there were too many. The commander's voice roared over the comms. We hold here. Hold here against this storm, against Cliff's raining fire. Her chest clenched. She knew what would happen. She could see it unfolding already, bodies left in the dirt, names lost in silence. And she couldn't let it happen again. She turned, voice tearing from her throat. There's another way. The commander's head snapped toward her. Shock, anger, but also something else, desperation. What did you say? She pointed, breath-ragged hand trembling toward a narrow cut in the ridge. Half hidden, almost invisible, but she had seen it hours ago, memorized its lines when no one else noticed. There, it'll take us through. Bullets struck the rock beside her, chips flying, but she didn't flinch. For a heartbeat, silence fell. And then the commander nodded. Move. The retreat was chaos. Men scrambling toward the cut, dragging each other through dust and fire. She fired until her rifle clicked empty, then dragged the boy again, his weight heavy but his grip steady on her arm. They spilled into the narrow path, shadows closing behind them, but the cliffs shielded them now, the fire thinning. Step by step, breath by breath, they fought their way through. Until finally silence. Not the silence of death, not the silence of defeat. The silence of survival. The men collapsed in the shadow of the cliffs, gasping, bleeding, alive. The commander looked at her, his face carved with exhaustion, his eyes unreadable. You saw it again, he said softly. Not a question this time, a truth. She didn't answer, just sat down, hands trembling, the photograph burning in her pocket. The boy lay beside her, pale but breathing, his eyes fixed on hers. You knew, he whispered. Her chest tightened. She nodded once slowly. And in that moment, the weight of silence broke. Later that night, when the camp was quiet, she finally unfolded the photograph. The firelight caught her sister's face, that smile frozen in time. She stared at it for a long time, her throat burning, her chest hollow. And then she whispered, so soft no one else could hear. I won't be silent anymore. Why didn't anyone sleep? The camp was quiet, the fire burned low, and the men lay sprawled across the dirt, but their eyes stayed open. Their breathing stayed shallow. Because survival doesn't mean safety. Survival just means waiting for the next storm. She sat apart again, back against the cold rock, the photograph folded tight in her hand. The edges had worn soft from years of touching it, from years of carrying memory like a blade hidden close to her heart. But tonight, something was different. The boy shifted closer, dragging his injured leg, his breath uneven. He eased down beside her, close enough that the heat of his body cut into her solitude. For a while he didn't speak, just sat in silence watching the fire. Then softly, without turning his head, he said, Who's in the picture? Her breath caught. She closed her hand around it, knuckles white. No one had ever asked. No one had ever noticed. She kept it hidden like a secret wound. But he had seen. She thought about lying, about telling him it was nothing, some distant memory, some stranger. But when she turned to him, she found his eyes steady, not prying, not cruel, just steady. And in that steadiness, something inside her broke. My sister, she whispered. His lips parted, but he said nothing, just waited. Her voice trembled. She was taken, years ago, before I joined, before all of this. The fire cracked, sparks drifting upward. The desert wind carried the sound away. She had never said it aloud in uniform before, never admitted that every bullet she chambered, every mile she marched, carried her sister's name. But now the words hung in the air, fragile and raw. The boy's eyes softened. I'm sorry. She looked away, her throat burning. Sorry, the world's cruelest word. Sorry didn't change graves. Sorry didn't bring back stolen faces. But still she nodded. Because in his voice, sorry didn't sound like pity. It sounded like truth. The next morning the commander gathered them again, his voice heavy, his face drawn with exhaustion. Enemy movements are tightening. We need to move fast. The extraction point is 3 days out. If we hesitate, we won't make it. The men nodded, though their bodies sagged, though the wounded groaned. And then his eyes flicked to her. Not dismissive, not doubtful, just measuring. As for the route, he said slowly, we'll need more than maps this time. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every head turned, eyes on her now. Not with scorn, not with disbelief, but with something sharper, something new. Expectation. Her chest tightened. For years she had been invisible, a burden. Now they looked at her as if her silence had been waiting for this moment. She swallowed, forcing her voice steady. There's a path east, narrow, hard to see on maps. It'll take us longer, but it'll keep us off the ridges. The commander studied her, then he nodded once. East it is. The march east was brutal. The path she had chosen wound through jagged rock, narrow canyons, places where the sun vanished and the air turned cold. The men cursed under their breath, stumbling on loose stone, dragging the wounded step by step. But no ambush came. Every ridge they passed stayed silent, every shadow stayed empty. And with each mile the men's eyes on her shifted again, less suspicion, more trust. But trust is a weight heavier than doubt. Because every decision now, every step rested on her shoulders. She carried it in silence. On the second night, as the men slept in the hollow of the canyon, the commander sat beside her. He didn't sit close, just near enough that his presence pressed against her solitude. For a while he said nothing. Then quietly he asked, "Why do you see things the rest of us miss?" Her chest tightened. She thought of the nights she had lain awake, listening for footsteps that never came. The years of scanning every crowd, every alley for a face she'd lost. The paranoia that had become instinct, the vigilance born of grief. She almost told him. But grief wasn't currency in war. Grief was weakness. So she only said, "Because I listen." He studied her, eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't press. He only nodded, then stood, leaving her alone again. But she felt his gaze linger long after. By the third day, the canyon opened into a stretch of scrubland. The extraction point lay ahead, still miles away, but the men began to taste the promise of safety. Their steps quickened, their voices rose thin with hope. But hope is dangerous. She felt it before she heard it. The quiet, the wrong kind. Her stomach knotted, her hand tightening on her rifle. And then the sound. The distant hum of engines, low, steady, growing louder. The men froze, heads snapping upward. Dust rose on the horizon, faint but unmistakable. Vehicles armed. The commander swore under his breath, "They've found us." Panic rippled through the ranks. They were exposed here, no ridges for cover, no rocks to hide behind, just open ground. Her pulse hammered. They couldn't outrun vehicles. They couldn't outgun them either. Unless... Her eyes swept the terrain, scanning, searching. And then she saw it, the faint line of dry riverbed cutting through the earth, narrow and twisting, almost invisible from above. It wasn't safe, it wasn't certain, but it was a chance. She turned, voice sharp, urgent. Into the riverbed, now. The commander's eyes locked with hers, one heartbeat, two, then he shouted the order. The men moved, stumbling, dragging each other into the dry channel. Dust swallowed them, the hum of engines growing closer, louder, until the sky shook with it. They crouched in silence, pressed against the earth, breaths held. The vehicles roared past above them, shadows flickering against the canyon walls. Dust rained down, choking, blinding. And then silence again. The sound faded, the engines vanished. They were gone. The men exhaled, some collapsing, some whispering prayers. But her hands still shook. Because survival wasn't victory. Survival was just another borrowed breath. That night they lit no fire, they spoke no words. They just lay under the stars, the silence heavier than any noise. She lay awake, staring at the photograph again, her sister's smile blurred by shadow. She thought of the boy's question, of the commander's gaze. And for the first time she wondered, maybe silence wasn't strength. Maybe silence was running. And she was tired of running. The next morning, as the sun rose over the scrubland, she made a choice. She would tell them. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough for them to understand why she listened when no one else did, why she carried silence like a shield. Because silence hadn't saved her sister. And maybe breaking it could save them. Why had her hands stopped shaking now when they hadn't stopped all morning? The weight of her rifle lay across her lap, balanced perfectly as if it belonged there. She hadn't spoken in hours. Words seemed useless in this kind of silence when even the wind carried too much sound. Around her the men shifted, whispered, exhaled. None of them looked at her, not really. They saw her presence but not her being. They knew her uniform, not her skin. They carried her name only as a checklist, never as a truth. She closed her eyes for a moment, resting her forehead against her knuckles. The metal smelled faintly of oil and gunpowder. The scent comforted her more than their words ever did. Burden. She'd heard it enough times that it no longer pricked the way it once had. But the scar inside was still there, layered with every dismissal, every side glance, every muttered remark that had cut sharper than any blade. She opened her eyes again. The valley below spread out like a canvas of shadows and stone, broken by the faint glow of firelight in the enemy camp. Voices drifted faintly upward, snatches of songs, curses, laughter too careless for soldiers. They had no idea she was here. No idea that her trigger finger was steady now, her breath slowing into rhythm. She could see their outlines through the scope. Too many of them, too many for her team to handle if it came to close quarters. And yet, they were moving toward something, something she couldn't place. The commander crouched beside her, his breath steaming in the chill air. He didn't meet her eyes either. "You've got the angle, we'll move once you start." His voice carried no doubt, no care, just instruction. She wanted to ask, start what? The plan was thin, nothing but paper folded against fire. But she bit her tongue because questioning never got her anything but rolled eyes. Still, the unease pressed against her chest. There was something off in the enemy formation, something she couldn't name yet. Her finger brushed the trigger. The world stilled, as if the night itself leaned closer to listen. But she hesitated, not from fear, from instinct. Something was wrong. She whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, "Wait." The commander frowned. "What?" She lifted her head slightly from the scope. "They're not moving right. Look," she gestured with the faintest motion, her eyes narrowing at the staggered torchlights below. "That's not patrol, that's cover. They're setting something." For a beat, silence. Then another soldier muttered, "She's imagining things again." The commander's jaw tightened. He almost dismissed her. Almost. Then a low, metallic sound drifted from the valley, a rumble not of voices but of machinery, subtle, hidden. If you weren't listening, you'd miss it. She had been listening. Her chest tightened with vindication and dread in equal measure. The commander finally looked at her then, really looked. His eyes reflected the faint torchlight, sharp and calculating. "What are they hiding?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, because deep down she already knew, and the answer would cost them all. Her throat worked against the words. Her silence stretched too long. The men shifted restlessly, one cursed under his breath. And she realized this was the moment she had to choose between staying small or speaking the truth that might finally carve her voice into the stone of their memories. She exhaled slow. "It's not just them down there, something else is coming, and if we don't move now, none of us will make it out." A chill swept through the group. For the first time, she wasn't background noise. For the first time, they felt the weight in her voice. But the valley was already moving, and she wasn't sure if her warning had come too late. Why was the night so quiet when death was already moving in the dark? She felt it before she saw it, the faint tremor under her elbows as the earth shifted, as if something heavy was crawling beneath the soil. Her breath caught. Through the scope, the enemy camp looked unchanged, men still laughing, shadows still weaving around the torches. But the noise, that low grinding, was growing louder. Her commander froze. The others glanced at one another, unease creeping into their silence. None of them wanted to be the first to believe her. None wanted to admit that maybe the burden had heard what they hadn't. Then the first flare shot into the air. It arced like a falling star, casting the valley in white fire. And in that light, everything changed. The ground tore open. Metal doors split wide where no one thought there were any. From beneath the valley floor, machines clawed their way up, dark, armored, their silhouettes jagged against the burning sky. Enemy soldiers cheered, their laughter turning to savage roars as the hidden convoy emerged. Not a camp, not a rest stop, a staging ground. Her stomach sank. They weren't a handful of men. They were an army preparing to move. One of her team cursed loud and harsh, the kind of word that stripped hope from the air. Another fumbled with his radio, desperate for a signal that wasn't there. Panic, quick and sharp, spread through them like fire catching dry grass. She didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. Her hands were still, her finger hovering on the trigger. Her eyes locked on the biggest of the machines crawling into the open, a transport bristling with weapons. If that reached the front lines. Her chest ached with the knowledge they had seconds, only seconds. The commander barked orders. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. He hadn't seen this coming. None of them had. Except her. She felt the old words rising in her chest again. Burden, unnecessary, distraction. And for a moment she almost let them choke her. Almost. But she exhaled, and with that breath she chose. The first shot cracked through the night, her shot. It pierced the chaos, sharp and unflinching, cutting into the transport's exposed panel before the machine had fully surfaced. Sparks erupted. The roar that followed was not human but mechanical, a wounded beast thrashing against its own steel skin. The men around her stared. They weren't moving yet, weren't fighting yet. They were frozen. But her hands kept working, smooth, relentless, bolt, aim, breath, trigger, each shot carving light into the darkness. The enemy swarmed now, shouts breaking against the hills, torches dropped, guns lifted, the valley turned alive with fire. Finally, her team joined. The commander's voice rose into the chaos, pulling them together, pushing them forward. But in the corner of his eyes, he kept looking at her, at the soldier they had called a burden, at the one holding their line when everything was breaking. Still, she felt no pride, only a weight, because she knew what none of them did yet. She knew the math of it. She knew the cost. And deep inside, she already felt the shape of her decision forming. It would not be survival she bought tonight. It would be time. How long could courage last when every second stripped another piece away? The night had erupted into a storm of fire, tracers lancing across the valley, the crack of rifles, the choking thunder of machines forcing themselves out of the earth. Her shots cut through it all, clean and exact, but the numbers below were endless. For every soldier that fell, 2 more rose in the smoke. Her breath came steady, but inside she was unraveling. She counted magazines by feel, fingers brushing cold metal in her vest. Too few, always too few. Each shot she took was a choice she couldn't take back. Every round spent was a round not there when they'd need it most. The commander knelt beside her, his jaw tight, eyes darting across the field. He looked older in that light, lined not with age but with sudden fear. "We can't hold this," he muttered. "We'll have to fall back." One of the men snapped his head toward him. "Fall back where? We're pinned, North Ridge is already cut off." Another cursed, clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. "We're done. We're already done." She listened, but her eyes never left the scope. Her world narrowed to one breath, one trigger, one enemy at a time, but their words wormed their way in. Retreat. Done. Lost. And yet beneath all the noise she heard something else. Faint, distant. Engines. Not theirs, reinforcements. No, wrong direction, wrong sound. Heavy transports moving toward the front. If those reached their lines, hundreds of her people would never see dawn. Her throat tightened. She saw the shape of it now, clear and merciless. The mission wasn't to win here. It never had been. It was to delay, to break the enemy's pace, to fracture their momentum, to buy the time others needed to survive. Her survival was never part of the equation. She lowered the scope just for a breath and looked at the men around her. Faces grim, pale, streaked with dirt and blood. Men who had dismissed her, ignored her, left her voice in silence. But in their eyes now she saw something new. Dependence. The quiet, desperate kind. They were watching her without saying it, trusting her without wanting to. Her chest ached under the weight of it. She thought of home then, not the way it had been, but the way she had left it. Her father's silence at the table, his disappointment disguised as caution. Her mother's hands trembling as they folded her uniform, whispering words that broke before they could form. Don't go. Don't let them use you. Don't be forgotten. But she had gone, and maybe this was why. Cover me, she said suddenly, her voice steady, sharper than she intended. The commander looked at her, really looked. What are you? She slid another magazine into place. There's a way to hold them, but I need to move. No, he barked, shaking his head. You'll never make it down there alive. Her eyes flicked back to the valley, to the transports groaning under their own weight. She didn't answer him. Didn't need to. The truth hung between them. For a moment, silence cut through the chaos. Then one of the younger soldiers, barely more than a boy, whispered, "She's right." His voice cracked, but his eyes were fierce. If those things get through, none of this matters. The commander's jaw clenched. His hand twitched toward her shoulder, then stopped. He wanted to forbid it, wanted to drag her back, but he didn't. Because he knew. Her decision had already been made. She pulled her hood tighter, checked the rifle sling, and felt the world slow around her. Fear gnawed at her ribs, but determination was stronger. The path ahead was clear. She rose to a crouch, ready to break from cover. And for the first time since the mission began, the commander whispered her name, not as a burden, but as a soldier. Was this how silence was supposed to feel? Heavy, endless, carrying more truth than words ever could. She broke from the ridge like a shadow loosed into fire, the rifle slung tight, boots sliding against shale. Bullets clawed at the air around her, sparks leaping from stone, but her body moved without hesitation. Every step was borrowed time, and she knew it. She welcomed it. Behind her, the men shouted, voices torn between orders and prayers. They were firing to cover her, but she barely heard them anymore. The valley roared too loud. The engines of the transports, the clatter of steel on stone, the guttural cries of soldiers who hadn't expected a lone figure to come running into their teeth. Her breath burned in her chest, but her mind was clear. She thought of her mother's hands, her father's silence, every glance that had written her off, every word that had cut her down. Burden. The word no longer wounded, it fueled. She dropped to a knee behind a jagged rock, pulled the rifle tight, and exhaled. The first shot struck the driver's viewport of a transport, spiderwebbing the glass. The second drove into the exposed vent beneath its plating. Smoke belched out. She moved again before the return fire shredded the stone where she'd knelt. Her path wasn't survival, it was sabotage, disruption, enough pain to stall an army. Grenades hung from her vest, two left. She thumbed one free, pulled the pin with her teeth, and let her body's rhythm count the seconds before she flung it under the nearest machine. The explosion ripped the night apart, fire washing against metal, the shockwave slamming into her chest. She staggered, kept moving. The enemy surged toward her now, furious, focused. They shouted in a language she didn't need to understand. Their intent was clear, and for every eye that turned to her, that was one less eye on the ridge, one less bullet for her team. The commander's voice cracked through her radio, raw with something he'd never let her hear before. "Come back, that's an order, fall back." She almost laughed, a bitter, soft sound, not because it was foolish but because he didn't realize she already had. She fallen back the moment she chose this. Fallen back into memory, into silence, into the truth of what she was meant to do. Her last grenade weighed heavy in her palm. She looked at the largest transport, the one still crawling forward despite its wounded brothers. It carried enough firepower to level the hills, enough to erase the line her people held miles ahead. She ran straight for it. Bullets tore through the ground around her, chipped against her shoulder, grazed her thigh. Pain flared hot, but her legs didn't break. She pressed on, every stride pounding like a drumbeat. Closer, closer. She pulled the pin. And in those final seconds, she wasn't thinking of the war. Not of orders, not of victories, not of men who had dismissed her. She thought of the quiet she'd always carried, the silence they had mistaken for weakness, the stillness they had mocked. But silence was not weakness. It was strength held tight until the world demanded it be released. Her last breath escaped as a whisper no one would ever hear. The grenade found its mark. The explosion consumed her. From the ridge, her team watched the fire bloom, swallowing the transport, tearing steel apart as if the earth itself had risen against it. The blast shook the valley, echoing like thunder into the night. When the smoke cleared, the convoy was broken, halted, delayed long enough for reinforcements to stand. Her choice had bought time, time enough to save thousands. On the ridge, no one spoke, not even the commander. They had no words, only the image of her silhouette swallowed in light. She had been called a burden, but now her silence would be remembered longer than their voices. And when dawn finally bled into the valley, it came gently, quietly, as if honoring the name she had carved, not with speeches, not with recognition, but with the dignity of an act that needed no explanation. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.